Hey, welcome to Hell in the Hallway podcast with your host, Billy. This segment is on relationships. I sent out another survey because people really responded and liked the survey in regards to relationships. And I got so many good questions that this is probably going to be a part two series. Let me tell you though, I'm really struggling with the idea in this quarantine that I can't get my hair done. I can't get my nails done. I got nails falling off. It's crazy. But let me make sure I say that this is not to minimize people who are struggling far worse than I am. I'm just really speaking in my privileged voice right now. And I can't wait for us to all be free to touch and hug one another and be connected again and to really value the connection that we had before, right? So I'm going to start off with a question that Tanya Chambers of Cleveland, Ohio submitted. And she stated that, and this is a great question, so awesome question. She says, as of late, I have resulted to the online dating craze. With that, I have found that folks are looking for a texting ship. Is this the new age of dating? Let's kind of define what that is first, right? When you're in this texting ship type of dating, what is actually happening is that you're never really meeting the person, you're not really connecting, and the relationship is not even considered on a long distance relationship because you're not even communicating with this person or FaceTiming. It's really the phone. It's really texting the entire time. And the question she asked is that, is this the new age of dating? I think this is a vulnerability in our dating. Okay, I think the fact that we can be so removed from people in this online forum, that texting gives us this sense of safetyness that we really don't have to be truly vulnerable. We really don't have to connect, and more importantly, we really don't have to commit. And when we really don't have to commit, we can live in multiple types of texting ship relationships, right? So you have to decide, at least from my perspective, because I've been through this as well, is really being able to tell people up front, what is it that you want? What are you looking for? And a person who knows what they want will tell you. If someone says, I'm not really sure, I'm kind of just going with the flow or something like that, take their word at face value that they're going with the flow, right? But if someone is telling you that, hey, I want a serious relationship, I want to meet, I want to go out, at least after this whole 6 feet thing has happened, I want to go out, I want to connect, I would say make sure they demonstrate that, right? I would say that we need to start making sure in relationships that we listen with our eyes, not just our ears. It's important that we watch what people are doing and that their words are matching their actions. So I think that's a great question. And I'm hoping that over the course of time, we move out of this because that doesn't lead to a successful relationship. And then guess what happens at the end of the day? People don't end. They just stop talking. It just ends up being over. And we're not connecting. There's no conversation. I just don't find it to be a healthy form of relationship. Let's see. Your next question, which I think is awesome, is in dating, I have noticed that there are a lot of hurt men who are hurt and broken, but they swear as the women. How can you help a hurt man without being consumed? Okay, first I want to add some balance, right? There's hurt men and there's hurt women because I don't want to give the impression that there's not hurt people on both sides who are destructive to the relationship process. What I will say, just to go specific to your question, I think there's difficulty in men being able to get in touch with their broken parts, to understand the notion of vulnerability and nurture those pieces of themselves that are unwell, right? Because men aren't socialized to do so, right? I have a male client that I work with, and we speak of nurturing, we speak about vulnerability, and more importantly, we speak about voids. A void that's in a man's life that he tends to fill it with things that are only temporary and they will never be sustained. So, your second part of your question reads, How can you help a hurt man without being consumed? Let me give that question a moment of silence. This is a hard answer. I think you will be consumed. I don't think you can help a person unless they're willing to help themselves. If they're able to look at their broken parts and say, you know what, I got to do something about this. I don't like this. I want to be a different person. And they're striving and they're not just talking about it and they're doing it. Then I think that's great. You can edify and you can support, right? So when it's that type of scenario, you're actually supporting the person, right? You're not lifting them by yourself, right? What ends up happening a lot is one or two things. People do not recognize their broken parts, or people don't want to work on their broken parts. They want you just to accept them. And we have to make a decision in that moment what we're going to do. Are we going to stay and chip away and doing our best trying to make a person want something that they don't want for themselves, resulting in nothing but frustration and lost time for us? It's not what you want. And see, let me tell you what happens when we do stuff like that. We expect ourselves from other people. We figure like, hey, I got myself out. I did this and we can do this together. You can't do that if that person is not willing. Because what ends up happening, they will tether an anchor to you and then you will sink just as deep as they are, right? So can you do it without being consumed? Only if they're ready to do the work themselves. But if they are not ready to do the work and they're not doing the work, I'm not saying it. There's a lot of people who talk about they got to get their life together. But if they're not actually doing the work, then yeah, you're going to be consumed. It's going to be difficult. So great question, Tanya. You have a couple of more questions. I'm going to make sure that I give those questions over during the other time, right? So these are really wonderful. I'm going to get to our other questions that we have. So let's see. Sheila asks a really incredible question. Is what do you do when you don't like your mate's minor children and your boyfriend insists on creating a relationship with them? Now, here's things that's true, right? So my children are grown now, but when, if I was dating with minor children, then children are a package deal. So you're going to struggle in a relationship being successful because you're kind of asking a person to kind of make a choice, right? But if your relationship isn't that serious and you guys are just kind of hanging out or hooking up or just dating or whatever the case may be, then maybe it can sustain because it's not serious. But once it reaches a level of commitment, then that's going to end up being a problem. I think what needs to happen, there has to be a conversation, there has to be a discussion with that person on what the barriers on liking those children or that child is, right? And again, consider how you deliver the package, right? You can't just say, oh, the kids is bad. Oh, I don't like them kids. Like, no, you can't say that, right? A mom or a dad is not going to respond well to you, right? Even if their kids are bad, they're not going to respond well to you with that. You have to sit down and be able to talk about the barriers that's allowing you to connect with those children. And then also recognize that children can be in various areas of the continuum of accepting who you are, right? So you also have to look at what their process is, because maybe they're rejecting, maybe they're acting a certain way to you because they feel threatened by your presence and what your presence might mean to their relationship with their parent. So what people don't recognize is that you're not just the one going through a process. Their mate's going through a process and their children is going through a process as well, right? So thank you for that question, Sheila. Awesome question. All right, I have a question from Wani Lockridge of Cleveland, Ohio. And at first I wanted him to kind of expand more on his question, right? But then I thought, I think I can actually respond. Even though it's a broad question, I can respond in a very broad way. So his question reads, why did she waste my time? Whew. So, couple things. Let's speak it from her perspective. Was she ready for a relationship? Was she able to sustain a relationship? Was she well herself, right? our relationships can only be successful to the level of vulnerability that we have with one another, right? So you have to be willing to be vulnerable, to be honest, to be authentic. Was she any of these things, right? Was she secure in her own self, right? So it really depends on kind of who she is as a person. But then it also depends on something else, right? Did you expect something from her that she was not prepared to give? Or did you expect yourself from her, right? A lot of times we have expectations of ourselves, of others, based on what we would do, right? And we can't do that. So it's important to kind of evaluate these questions. Now, my cousin put a comment in that says no relationship is a waste of time. In part, I agree with him, right? Because we can always learn from that relationship on what we will take, what we will not take, what that person has taught us about ourselves, because you really should sit down and do work on yourself after every relationship. But guess what? Nobody does that. You know what they do? They carry that 8-piece luggage of emotional baggage into the next relationship. That's what they do. Instead of actually doing the work and saying, let me sit with myself first. What ends up happening, people jump from relationship to relationship to relationship and never do the work of figuring out what was going on in the first place, and then can't quite understand why they can't have a successful relationship. But it's a couple of things to pay attention to in regards of wasting time. What were your expectations? What were her expectations? Did you see patterns that you chose to ignore? Was the avatar present the first few months, and then after that she showed up on who she really was, right? That happens with men as well. And then we have to make a decision on what we want to do at that point. But what we tend to do, instead of making a decision right then and there, we ride it out because we're saying they're going to change. Yep. They're going to go back to who they were before. And that's not necessarily the case, right? So it's important to recognize those particular patterns and have a discussion about those patterns that you're seeing. So thanks a lot, Juan. I think it's an awesome question. Van Webb of Cleveland, Ohio sent a very interesting question. I really say it's rooted in values and acceptance. His question reads, where did people pick up nasty sexual displays of affection? And he speaks of the idea of oral sex. That's what he speaks to. And I don't want to be too rated R in here. But his overall question reads, is where are the morals of human beings? And here's what I'll say to that, Van Webb of Cleveland. Actually, thank you so much for your question. I think it's a valid question to understand morality. But I do think morality is personal to the person, right? On what a person considers disgusting is another person's cup of tea. And what we have to recognize, these things that we think are new are not really new sexual acts, right? They're new to our level of acceptance. So in the United States, we live in our society is based in very Puritan values, but is an undercurrent of sexuality, and that deserves its own podcast to itself. And all that means is that the idea of oral sex or any type of sexual act that seems uncommon is just really not made to be public. It's just a current taboo, right? Like, for example, I have earrings, right? It's no big deal that I have earrings today, but years ago, this would have been taboo. Oh my God, big deal. It would have been a huge deal for me to have earrings, right? I have a tattoo. Oh my goodness, that would have been so taboo some years ago. Big deal it would have been. It's like nothing today, right? So things shift in terms of our acceptability, but the behavior, Van, was always there, right? So these things that we think are new and where are the morals, they're not new. What is new is the level of acceptance that's happening. So great question. Thank you for that. Gino Blair of Cleveland, Ohio asked a very, very awesome question as well. And his question reads, can someone truly honor, obey, and commit to a mate with all their heart without honoring, obeying, and committing to God? Awesome question. Now we're going to answer that question from a spiritual perspective. Now here's really, I think it's perspective that's important here. It's the operative word. In my personal understanding is the justification is the idea that I have professed with my mouth and believed with my heart that Jesus is my Lord and Savior, right? And in that is I am justified. So, hey, I got the ticket. I'm going, right? But sanctification is a different process. It's not the same process, and we confuse the two sometimes. So the process of sanctification is your continuum of shifting, of changing, of doing those things that you spoke about in your question, honoring, obeying, and committing to God, right? So in the very beginning of this relationship with Christ, right, you may still be struggling in your sinful areas, in the number of areas you might be struggling in, right? But as time progresses, you start giving more of yourself because you want to, not because you have to, because you want to, right? Because the love becomes greater than the sin. However, everybody's not on the same continuum. Everybody's not. Everybody is in different points of that continuum, and you have to understand that, right? Now, you have to accept that's where that person is, where the other person is. But does that mean you have to accept it for you? Nope. You do have to accept the person for where they are in their own process. And that's where the concept of evenly yoked actually comes from. So that way, that disparity, that space that exists between your spiritual process and my spiritual process, as little as that space is going to be increasingly more healthy. If there's a big space in it, you're going to have some struggles. There's going to be some issues that show up in that, right? So thank you for that question. I thought it was an awesome question, but I don't think it's as black and white as it seems. I think it really does depend on where you are in your sanctification process, right? Thanks a lot for that, Gino. So Lawrence asked a very good question, and Lawrence Adams of Cleveland, Ohio, and his question reads, what 5 characteristics should a person look for in a mate? Thank you for that. So I would say authenticity. A person needs to be authentic to themselves first. There is more pain in not being authentic than the pain of someone not accepting your authenticity. If you're not able to be your true self, then you develop what's called an avatar, right? And so think about an avatar as the image that we place for people to see. But guess what, folks? You can only hold that avatar for so long. And that's also known as the representative. I've heard people speak it in that vein as well. So when you keep up an avatar, you keep up a representative, over the course of time, that's going to erode and the real you shows up. And when the real you shows up, then there starts to be some issues in the relationship. And people are like, you're not who you presented. Well, no, because they weren't being authentic. And maybe because they didn't feel like the relationship was safe enough to be. And because they didn't value authenticity in themselves. I would also speak to security. A person needs to be secure in themselves. Now that takes some work. So we're on different points of the continuum in our security, right? There's some things that we're secure about, things we're not so secure about, and that's okay. But overall, as a person, as it pertains to my personhood, I'm secure. Even in my failings, I'm secure. So it's important to be secure, because what ends up happening, you start projecting your insecurity onto someone else. And it's important to not do that, because you're going to look at relationships through the lens of mistrust and distrust. I would also speak to vulnerable. A person should be vulnerable. They should be able to speak to their good things. They should be able to speak to their brokenness, because as much as vulnerable as they can be is the degree of connection that they can have with you. So you have to have a level of vulnerability in order for that relationship to be successful. I truly believe that the strength of relationship is based on the level of vulnerability that both partners can sustain, right? So we have authenticity, we have security, we have vulnerability. I will speak to a spirituality piece, right? Here's why. People are on different levels. And listen, if both partners have no spirituality, that's a win, right? But if a person has a spiritual practice, has a religious practice, have a belief practice, and the other person doesn't, then you're gonna have some issues. You're gonna have some struggles, right? There's gonna be some issues in that. So being able to recognize where you are in that spiritual space. And I'm going to speak a word that's not really used often, but it's actually a word that I really enjoy using frequently, is honor. Why do I say a person should be honorable? Because the notion of loyalty and honesty and integrity lives all in that space. Honor. And I speak to honor well before I speak to loyalty, and let me explain why. If you're an honorable person, you are loyal anyway. And guess what? You're loyal to the right people. Because you can be just loyal, right? But that doesn't mean you're loyal to the right people. It can mean you can be loyal to somebody you got no business being loyal to, right? So it's important that we recognize that a person should have honor. And in that, that person is authentic, that person is honest, that person has integrity, that person can critically evaluate a situation and say, this is good for me, this is not good for me, this is good for us, this is not good for us. They're able to really have a sense of confidence in their own thought process, right? They can critically evaluate their own decision making and being able to admit and own the direction for their lives, right? So a person who has honor is able to stand and able to stand in their decision making. They're also able to admit their vulnerabilities, and they're also able to be secure. They're able to be loyal. So those are characteristics that I particularly enjoy. Now, of course, you want somebody who's attractive and, you know, all those other things. And you can speak to financial stability. You can speak to those things. But I really think that's depending on the couple and then the individual. So that's such a varied question. I want to hold off on adding the financial piece because it's important, but it's a separate idea. All right. Thanks a lot, Lawrence, for that question. Let's see. I think we have time for one more, and then we will do part 2, right? Next time, because there's so many great questions. So I got a question that was anonymous, and I will keep you anonymous and won't mention your name or list your picture. But he asked a question about polygamy. He said, can you handle a polygamous relationship? What is that like? Can a relationship sustain it, right? I think that goes back to rules. What is the rule for the relationship? And what is the rule for each partner in that relationship, you know? Because here's the thing. If every partner is sustained the same amount of energy, whoo, that's going to be tough holding all them up, right? And what does that mean? Are you equitable in that, right? So what does that mean? So as a male, you have multiple women that you're in a relationship with, but is she allowed to have multiple relationships with other men or just with you? So the idea of rules is really important in that, right? I will also say, I would evaluate why that's what you're looking for. And here's why. Mr. Anonymous, I'm not even trying to judge what you're asking. I'm really trying to understand why is that a value for you, right? Just to understand, like, is it because I have some fears and I do not believe monogamous relationships work? Is there something in that? Or is this something that I truly like to engage in? And just being able to explore that. So those are different questions for that. Again, I'm not judging the decision if that's a decision you're making for yourself. And if you're honest with everyone that you're having it with, right? It's when people are not honest that it turns into something else. And I've seen some relationships where a man has told a woman that he was engaging in multiple relationships, that he has no plans on committing. And when she recognized that he really was serious about that, she was upset. And I was like, but he was honest. Listen to what he's telling you that he's doing, right? So anyway, back to your question, is that I think people can handle to the level that they're being honest with. So I think on the surface, people might say like, oh yeah, that's good, that's cool, that's cool, that's cool. And then it ends up not being really cool because they have decided they want some level of exclusivity. So do I think it can work? It really depends. Do I find that historically it works? It really doesn't. It doesn't sustain. Now, if you're just dating multiple people, that's different, right? Because you're really getting to know people. But once it becomes to a level of exclusivity, Mr. Anonymous, somebody always ends up feeling cheated. Someone always wants more than what you're able to give. And that's when things start to crumble, you know. So I have several more questions. I'm going to offer them in a separate segment because we had so many good questions. I want to thank you so much for sending them. And we have to recognize that relationships themselves are a process, right? They go through a revelation themselves. We never quite arrive. Where you are in the very beginning of relationships should be very different if you're in 5 years later, right? There's a sense of oneness that occurs. I wrote a book on relationships. It's called The Session, and I'm mentioning it not just as a plug, get it, but more about, it's really about the process of the life, death, and resurrection of relationships. And it's about understanding your brokenness that lives within them, you know. So recognize, folks, that life is not just about the destination, as important as it is. It's also about revelation, even in our relationships. So thank you so much in tuning in, and I hope to see you again, and allow us to prosper during this quarantine season and stay connected as much as we can, and foster our relationships. So thanks again.